I've lived long enough to watch video games be dismissed as toys, then feared as distractions, then celebrated as culture. And every phase of that journey tells you something uncomfortable about how innovation actually happens. Because the evolution of video games from Atari to PlayStation is not a clean story of better graphics and faster processors. It is a story of misunderstanding, collapse, stubborn reinvention, and the slow realization that games were never about machines. They were about agency, about giving humans a space where effort mattered and failure was safe. Atari didn't begin as an industry. It began as a trick. Pong was simple to the point of absurdity. 2 paddles a dot, and a rule everyone understood in seconds. That simplicity was the breakthrough. Atari didn't sell complexity. It sold immediacy. For the first time, a machine responded to you in real time, not with buttons that triggered fixed outcomes, but with feedback that felt alive. Arcades became temples, not because the games were deep, but because they were social. You stood shoulder to shoulder, coins lined up, watching skill reveal itself publicly. Games were performance before they were products, but success came too fast. Atari expanded recklessly, flooding the market with low-quality titles, chasing licensing deals instead of respecting the medium. The infamous crash of 1983 wasn't caused by technology, it was caused by arrogance. Too many games, too little quality, no trust. Retailers lost faith. Consumers walked away. Video games, once hailed as the future, were pronounced dead almost overnight. This is the first lesson the industry learned the hard way. When you treat games as disposable content instead of crafted experiences, the audience punishes you brutally. Nintendo understood this when it entered a burned market everyone else had abandoned. The NES wasn't sold as a computer or a console. It was sold as a toy, deliberately downplaying ambition to regain trust. But inside that gray box was discipline Atari never had. Nintendo controlled quality with an iron fist. The seal of quality wasn't marketing fluff, it was a gate. Developers had to earn access. Cartridges were expensive, limits were tight, and creativity was forced to work within constraints. Those constraints didn't suffocate games. They sharpened them. Mario wasn't just a mascot. He was a design philosophy. Easy to pick up, brutally precise to master. Games stopped being about reflex alone and started being about learning. Patterns, timing, commitment. Failure became instructional instead of humiliating. Nintendo reframed games as something you could grow into, not just consume. That shift saved the industry, but it also narrowed it. Nintendo curated joy, but it also censored edge. Games were safe, friendly, and controlled. Then came Sega, and with it, rebellion. Sega didn't try to out-Nintendo Nintendo. It attacked from the side. Faster, louder, cooler. Sonic wasn't just a character, he was an attitude. Sega embraced teens' aggression competition. Marketing got sharper. Console wars became real. This rivalry mattered because it expanded the audience. Games no longer had to be wholesome to be legitimate. They could be expressive, even confrontational. But Sega still fought on hardware cycles and mascots. The medium itself was about to shift again. The real inflection point arrived when technology finally allowed games to grow up in 3 dimensions. This wasn't just a graphical upgrade. It was a cognitive one. Moving through space, controlling cameras, navigating worlds instead of screens, required new literacy. This transition killed companies that couldn't adapt. It rewarded those willing to rethink everything from controls to storytelling. This is where Sony entered, and why PlayStation mattered so much more than its spec sheet. Sony didn't come from toys. It came from music, film, electronics culture. It understood something Nintendo and Sega underestimated: games were no longer just for children. They were for anyone who wanted immersion. The original PlayStation didn't ask permission from parents. It spoke directly to players. CDs replaced cartridges, lowering costs and inviting experimentation. Developers flooded in. Risk returned. Genres exploded. Games became weird, cinematic, emotional, unfinished, in ways that felt alive instead of broken. PlayStation didn't win because it had better hardware. It won because it trusted developers and respected players as adults. Storytelling deepened. Identity entered the medium. Games stopped pretending they were toys and started exploring fear, loneliness, ambition, morality. This wasn't always elegant, but it was honest. The audience responded because they had been waiting to be taken seriously. What ties Atari to PlayStation together is not progress, but correction. Each era overreached, collapsed, and was rebuilt by someone who learned the right lesson from the previous failure. Atari taught immediacy. Nintendo taught discipline. Sega taught attitude. Sony taught breadth. Video games evolved not by linear improvement, but by surviving their own excesses. And this is where the story does not stop, because once games became worlds instead of screens, once they became industries larger than film and music combined, the stakes changed again. And the question shifted from whether games mattered to how much responsibility comes with shaping reality for millions of people who now live parts of their lives inside these systems. And the sentence continues into the next phase, where scale, culture, and consequence collide, and the evolution of video games enters its most complex chapter. Yet where games stopped being products you finished and started becoming places you lived, because once PlayStation helped normalize immersive worlds online, connectivity turned those worlds into persistent societies. Consoles were no longer endpoints. They were portals. Players didn't just beat levels. They built identities, reputations, friendships, and rivalries that outlived any single title. The moment games connected people at scale, the industry crossed a line it could never uncross. It stopped entertaining behavior and started shaping it. Online play changed the psychology of gaming completely. Failure was no longer private. It was social. Skill became visible. Communities formed their own hierarchies, languages, and norms. This amplified everything good and everything ugly at the same time. Cooperation flourished. Toxicity followed. Games became mirrors reflecting human behavior under pressure with brutal clarity. Designers could no longer pretend they were just building mechanics. They were designing social systems, and social systems always produce consequences their creators didn't fully intend. The rise of open-world design deepened this responsibility. Games stopped guiding players down narrow paths and started offering choice, consequence, and moral ambiguity. Freedom became the feature. But freedom without meaning quickly turns hollow. The best games understood this and anchored agency to narrative ethics and cost. Choices mattered because they excluded other choices. This wasn't technological progress. It was philosophical maturity. Games were learning the same lesson societies learn: agency without responsibility collapses into noise. At the same time, the business model shifted again. Live services, downloadable content, and monetization loops replaced the old idea of a finished game. This kept studios alive, but introduced new tension. When revenue depends on retention, design starts negotiating with addiction. When progression is tied to spending, fairness erodes quietly. The industry found itself wrestling with the same question social platforms face: how do you sustain engagement without exploiting it? There are no clean answers here, only trade-offs, and the companies that pretend otherwise eventually lose trust. PlayStation's legacy in this phase was not dominance, but normalization. It made space for games to be many things at once: art, sport, social network, escapism, and profession. Esports emerged. Streaming turned play into performance. again echoing the arcade days at global scale. The circle closed, but at a higher altitude. Watching skill became entertainment. Playing became labor for some, refuge for others, and identity for millions. Games were no longer niche. They were infrastructure. Looking back from Atari to PlayStation and beyond, the evolution of video games teaches a harsh but useful lesson. The medium doesn't grow by chasing power. It grows by correcting its own excesses. Every crash forced humility. Every revival required restraint, paired with imagination. When games respected players, the industry thrived. When it treated them as wallets or data points, backlash followed. The pattern is consistent because the core hasn't changed. Games are contracts between creators and players about effort, fairness, and meaning. The future of games will not be decided by graphics or hardware alone. It will be decided by whether builders remember what made the medium powerful in the first place: the joy of learning, the dignity of skill, the safety of failure, and the respect for the player's time and agency. Atari taught immediacy. Nintendo taught discipline. Sega taught attitude. PlayStation taught trust. What comes next will be defined by whether the industry can carry all those lessons forward without dropping the hardest one of all, responsibility at scale. And if this journey through the evolution of video games resonated with you, stay with this channel. Subscribe, because this is where we explore how industries grow up, not just how they get bigger. And leave a comment sharing which era of gaming shaped you most, because the games we grew up with often reveal exactly what we were searching for at that moment in our lives.